this session on addressing the uncertainties of global growth. We have a very distinguished panel before us. These uncertainties are multiple in various directions. There are uncertainties on what the financial and economic world will look like, or what it could look like, even if, let us assume, that the world would have just managed to steer off a much deeper recession, which was at some time feared or contemplated. So the one important uncertainty is, where do we see the global economy, which is going, particularly in the 24. The second is really, in what manner do we assess the geopolitical configurations and the possible disruptions which could take place. And the third and the final issue on which I'd like to get the panelists to really comment on is, what do they see the future? How are the financing needs of this uncertain world? I mean, let us assume, for instance, that we accept the broad ballpark figure of the need for around $4 trillion per annum by way of additional investments. And if we assume, for instance, when it comes to resource mobilization for domestic thing, it would have to be a combination of both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And of course, the multilateral development agencies acting in concert on the basis of certain framework. So let's assume that if we wish out the 3 trillion, come to 1 trillion which is needed. And the 1 trillion which will be a focus of today's, out of that 1 trillion, if 500 billion come out of private capital, and we couldn't have had a better representative and spokesman of what is possible, not possible, doable, not doable, than the one and only redoubtable Mark Carney. And therefore, considering that, Mark, you have another session after me, when I request you to make some comments on that. So the 500 billion, let us assume, come from private capital. And we expect really that, as far as the multilateral development banks themselves are concerned, added together, if they were doing roughly in 2019 a ballpark figure of about, let's say, about $110 billion a year, the proposal, which is contained in a report which I had the privilege to co-chair along with Larry Summers, I find, Rachel, with you and with Veera, and with Mark's support, that this is a virtual recreation of the independent expert group. Pity Nick couldn't come today, because that would have really made 3/4 of the group present here. Of course, Tharman is in town, but Tharman, while he has signed the report, I think that rightly he has recused himself, and we didn't even wish to invite Tharman. So more or less, this is a scenario that we gave 2 reports. Bottom line in the report that we gave was that it's a triple agenda. That was the framework of the first report. Why triple? Triple the extent of financial access from 110 billion to roughly close to 400 billion. Is that doable? What are the policies which are necessary to make it doable? Triple in terms of the windows. So traditionally, we all know that the World Bank and multilateral development banks in general have had a dual mandate, which is poverty and shared prosperity. Now, we have sought to add a third dimension, weave into it the issues of climate, global warming, and change of that kind. So that's the triple agenda. So triple financing, triple the mandate, and triple the mechanism. Mechanism has been so far, in terms of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, for purposes of development and concessional finance. You add to it an innovative window, which is being increasingly discussed, of allowing flexibility in countries who may wish to put in additional capital for a very, very specific purpose designed for global warming, climate change. So that was the triple first report. The second report, which we called better in terms of the multilateral development banks working more cohesively as a family than acting in silos, better in terms of being able to develop country platforms, have a credible pipeline of project, and get client engagement more purposefully. So that's would add up to a better bank, processes and procedures of the system being greatly changed, bolder in terms of the risk aversion, which currently really enables the multilateral institutions to harness their own balance sheet without being able to seek private capital extensively and innovatively. The use, for instance, of guarantees, what can be done. The use, for instance, of other instruments which are possible. Of course, always avoiding the cascade and mindful of the cascade. Bigger in terms of assuming that, let's say, the World Bank has been able to lend so far $900 billion from just a capital structure of $22 billion, which is so far. So that's a very high leveraging. How can that be enhanced? And how can there be a political will among the major shareholders to enhance the capitalization of not only the World Bank, but since every multilateral development bank is unique in the sense of having their own accountability patterns and their own shareholding structure, how can shareholders be incentivized? So this is really broadly the overall structure, which is the third component of that. So before I go in further, since time is somewhat short, can I request now hand over and request this very, very distinguished panel to make their comments and observations. Looking at the fact that Mark, who has very kindly agreed to be part of this panel, is really the person of the moment, in the sense that apart from the exceedingly long public policy history as Governor of the Central Bank in Canada, his own policy for us in terms of the issues of global concern with the United Nations and so on, is also advising the current presidency of the World Bank, along with a few others, and a very distinguished set of people, of which from India, Chairman Tata Sons is a member of that group. So Mark, would you share with us your perspective on the broader set of these issues, some of which I have per se touched on? Mark.
Thank you very much, NK, and thank you for including me in this panel. It's a pleasure. I want to try to speak as quickly as possible so I can learn as much from my fellow panel members, because I always learn when they speak. That's what one point I've got. Let me put a macro framing very quickly, and then talk about some of the specifics as you referenced on, particularly with respect to private capital. First, in terms of the uncertainties in this world and the geopolitical and the intersection with the global economy, this more fragmented world, to say it more positively, a world that's being rewired. One of the consequences of that, a world that has more of an inflationary as opposed to a disinflationary impulse, some of the consequences of that is it's a higher cost of capital for everybody. The costs of the capital pools are more fragmented. The risk premia are potentially higher. So for what much of what we will address, and there are many challenges in the world, but if I concentrate on the climate crisis, we have now some headwinds. Whereas a few years ago, I would have started off and said, we're in a world of flat interest rates, low interest rates. Here's a chance to make a bit of a pickup, and the economics would have worked much better. So there's headwinds that are there, and I would suggest that they are structural headwinds, regardless of what happens with the Fed this year. In general, interest rates are going to be higher. There are going to be bigger sovereign risk premia. There's going to be more volatility, and it's going to matter even more what your domestic enabling environment is. The role of the system, if I can put it that way, will be that much more important. First point. Second point, and I'll get off macro in a second, another macro point, which is in a world of lower growth, the importance of tackling the climate crisis is paramount. I'll give two examples for that. One, we had a series of outsized extreme weather events. I hate to say this may what was a series of tail events probably will look increasingly like the central scenario going forward. But the scale and the severity of whether there were fires in North America or floods, I won't go through the whole list. Estimate from Allianz was that cut about 0.6% off global growth. Just the cost of those events and the disruption from them. That is a big, big number. It doesn't have to be precisely right, but directionally it gives a sense. And the estimates that have been done in terms of the physical impacts of climate change over the balance of this century, unaddressed, 2.5 to 3% degree global warming, is the equivalent of a decade of no growth. The cumulative impact of that. These are, again, enormous numbers in a world that needs growth. So the motivation is there. And this is one, and I want to commend Chandra and the B20, is one of the many things they did was to bring to the fore this alignment of the core interest. Of course, this is an issue of social justice. It's an issue of poverty. There's many other motivations, intergenerational fairness, but actually just from a raw growth perspective. Okay, so what do we do about it? The first thing is we get people with the last name that begins with S to tackle the problem. So we have Singh, Summers, Songway, Stern, and many of the ants. And my co-chair helping the president, Ajay Banga of the World Bank, is Shriti Vadira. So I'm the outlier, and I should get rid of me because I'm not going to be there, but I'm associated with it. Many of the answers are at the heart of these reports. And so it's the implementation of the core and moving from the analytic to the implementation. An additional component of the answer began to be provided at COP, the COP28, with provision of some innovative capital in scale from the Emiratis. The headline figure was 35 billion that realistically will scale up to $250 billion of flow. So these are quite large numbers. But as important as that was, a component of this was what so-called catalytic capital, so it had a much lower return threshold, and it starts to solve things. Okay, I'm going to give a case study and then draw a conclusion from that, directions from that. Let's say you owned a coal plant in Indonesia. It was built in the last 10 years. It's got a 40-year life. It would have cost you, the asset value of that, without addressing it, is something on the order of $400 million on scale. So large-scale coal plant there. Now, we cannot have that coal plant, the world cannot have that coal plant run to the end of its useful life, or it and its peers to run to its useful life and keep global warming below 2 degrees. So it needs to be shut down. But if it's shut down 10 years from now, the economic cost of that shutdown is about 150 million to 170 million. How do we recover that cost? Somebody owns it. The owner could bear the cost, the government could bear the cost, or we could bear the cost through a combination of financing costs being lowered through structures, and I'll touch on some of those. And my punchline is about a third to maximum of half could be borne by reducing the financing costs through catalytic capital, first loss capital, some private capital whose spreads were brought down. But the balance needs to come from somewhere else, and it could come from a government, it could come from the owner, a combination of those. It's unlikely to come from aid money per se. And the fourth element, and Rachel and others have worked hard on this. I don't know how Rachel has time to work on everything she works on, but have worked hard on this, is if we could have a proper high-integrity end-to-end voluntary carbon market, actually 2/3 of the cost of that $170 million that I just referenced could be met by a voluntary credit that covered the difference of the emissions on something on the order of $8 to $10 per ton, which is an entirely reasonable carbon price. In fact, it's much lower than the carbon price nest. I use up my precious time to give the example because our work has to be disciplined by real examples of investments that motivate the investments in clean elements, and understanding the magnitudes are critical there. So last points, just to get to it. The interest in private capital, in being part of the solution in the major emerging economies is very high. That interest needs to extend to all emerging and developing economies, and for that we need the outcomes of the 4 S's and through the private sector. I mean, we really do. We need those outcomes to come there. We will need, in my judgment, some form of voluntary carbon market, or first best is a price on carbon that has that effect. But we need some combination of that in order to help square the circle. We also need something which is very basic. But in a world, and I'm going to finish on this, and we can have other discussion and questions, in a world of common but differentiated responsibilities, in a world of different starting points, said the same way, of different industrial structures. The private providers of capital need to know that what they are funding is consistent with a transition pathway that the world has agreed on, a less than 2-degree transition path. That is a different pathway in India than it is in Canada, than it is in Cameroon, etc. And we need an independent assessor of those pathways. And one of our challenges is to find that from amongst the multilateral organizations. It seems like an arcane plumbing point, but it's really, really important, and it helps to unlock alongside capital structures. So with that, maybe I should stop so others can speak.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. By some coincidence, yesterday in a different panel where we missed you, Indrawati, the finance minister of Indonesia, was a panelist. And we did talk about the coal plant, Veera, if you remember. And we did also talk about the issues not only of the orderly transition, but the issue of the human resource and other socially disruptive factors for the transition to be orderly. I mean, if millions of people in India, and it's true of Indonesia and many emerging markets, are for generations worked on coal plants, which are high footprints of fossil fuel, then to shut that coal plant down and to move to renewables has certainly financial costs, which you have brought out so dramatically, including some possibilities, Mark, of financing it. But there are these components also. But Veera, since you were integral to yesterday's panel discussion, some of which really Mark has brilliantly touched on, would like to make your observations. Veera?
Yes, no, thank you again to the B20 for putting together this panel, and always insightful and good to see old friends and learn new things, and to see that implementation is actually happening in some of the places. Addressing uncertainties of global growth, I think my sense is we are now in a period where we are going to continuously have uncertainties on global growth. I think if we just look at what happened 2 or 3 days ago with the Yemen Houthi problems and the whole shipping industry, which we thought was finally coming back together again because the Black Sea was open. Now, no, we have to go around Africa. Costs are going to go up. Insurance costs are going to go up. And again, I'm not even sure, and Mark can say something about it, whether this inflation fight is going to work, right? Because prices are back up again. And so I worry for Christine and Powell and what they will say in their next meeting. But that is another uncertainty. And I think we really are, this is not sort of a one-off. We are in a step change. The VIX index, which sort of measures volatility, is, hitting its new highs. And so then the question becomes, do we have the kinds of institutions that are ready for this kinds of continuous non-stop crises which are affecting our economies, putting pressure on prices, demand side, supply side constraints are happening at the same time. I wish Keynes and the rest were managing these things with one side working and the other side, stable, and maybe we just, is it the labor market, is it inflation, is it, exchange rate controls? Now it's everything. And I think that is the world in which we're living in. And I think the report talks a lot about, we talk about bigger, bolder, and better. We talk about, what the MDBs need to do. And yes, some of it is financing, a lot of it is financing, but Mark made the point, I think the most important on the countryside is policy. The most important on the MDB side is the right staff to give the right advice at the right time. What do you do when, the U.S. is increasing interest rates? What kind of macroprudential policies can you put in place? Do we even have the data for that? It's not yet clear that we know how to do it. However, what we have seen, and I take a lot of comfort in the fact that in 2008, when we had the financial crisis and Mark was at the wheel in some part of a central bank somewhere working on this, they put together, huge reforms at the time. Some of us thought, oh my God, and some of them we're going to work on again, the Basels and all that. But what has happened is we have seen going through this crisis that a lot of the uncertainty and the resilience of the financial system is strong. The NPLs are low. They are probably, household debt is high, sovereign debt is high, the financial system is sailing through. I don't know what magic you did, so maybe you have to go around the country. But so clearly we can build resilience. We can build resilience with, first, good policies on the regulatory side. And Mark talked about carbon markets and how that should work and how we should finance it. That's part of the regulatory, that's part of the transparency, the integrity of the financial system. But also what we need to do is build the kinds of infrastructure that are needed for financial systems to bring down prices. In Africa last year, no country went to market. They were shut out. The premiums were too high. Nobody could afford to go to market. We need good debt to grow. If you cannot afford good debt, you cannot grow. So the uncertainties of global growth are also the uncertainties of market access so that we can have additional cheap concessional capital. And again, in the example that Mark gave, why do we need the MDBs to become bigger, better, bolder, and stronger? It's because we need that portion of concessional capital to come in and do, even in the best reform environment, when all the utilities are profitable, there is still going to be a last mile of a population that cannot afford that electricity. And so we're going to need some compensation for that investment. If the coal plant shuts, 3,500 people in South Africa, 13,000 people don't have a job, we need to put them through some kind of retraining process. We need concessional capital for that, for the whole system to be able to come together and work well. And I think those are the stories that Sri was also talking about yesterday in Indonesia, what happens with those coal plants. So I think what the report was trying to say is, in this triple agenda, resources are critical. Infrastructure, whether that is the global public infrastructure that India is putting together with the B20 that will help to do things bigger, better, and faster, and in a more economic way, or whether it is the intellectual manpower and infrastructure that the MDBs are giving because country platforms are working and working well and better. I think if we can bring these things together, we begin to manage these uncertainties because we've built resilience. And the financial sector has shown us that if we do it, it can actually work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veera. By the way, Veera, I must confess that this seems to be all four of us, perhaps at least leaving since Matthew's comments not here, we look to be looking very much into issues which we dealt with, some with tentative conclusions. But Mark, thank you for bringing up this business of the carbon market and what would be a credible, transparent mechanism and what kind of pricing on carbon cost would be reasonable, affordable, and so on. And Veera, you talked about the same. If I were to turn to you, Rachel, and seek your advice on some of the issues which have been raised, Rachel, since you were also, by the way, present in Ahmedabad when we presented for the first time the contours of our triple report, on the proposal that Mark seems to be pushing on a carbon market. And I think that that's an innovative way of getting different stakeholders together. The issue of the carbon market has a long way to go. So, Rachel, it's all yours. I hand over the mic to you.
Thank you very much, NK. Thank you to the B20 for the invitation to be here with friends and colleagues, and to the CII for your leadership. Well, just to link the carbon markets to the question of uncertainty, I think that 2023 for me was a year of violent agreement about what needed to happen. I mean, we saw report after report, and I think the work that NK and Larry led us all in, there's no real disagreement about the conclusions we reached and the recommendations we made. So the uncertainty is whether or not we can align the owners of the MDB system with those who need to use the MDB system, together with the management of the MDB system in a sort of an approach of urgency to the kinds of changes that need to be made. Some of those are big political questions, which are going to be difficult in 2024. But there's an awful lot that can be done without having to sort of answer the question of Western liberal democracy. And so for me, the question then became compounded at the end of the year, coming out of a COP with so much public-private partnership around pledges for action, and then also compounded here in Davos, where we can see how fast things can change when along a value chain different actors begin to participate and collectively make a change. So, for example, I chaired the first meeting of the shipping industry 5 or 6 years ago here at Davos to talk about, well, how are we going to get to net zero vessels and shipping? And just 5 or 6 years later, we now have a reasonable sense of what date that's going to happen at, how it's going to happen, who needs to be involved, and probably half of the people who need to be involved are already involved. So things can go, and we see this with green steel as well, things are starting to go very fast. And so the demand signal is there if policymakers care to listen to it and to feel it. Now, all of that in a world where we don't have effective pricing of carbon, all of that in a world where we don't have enough jurisdictions with effective pricing of carbon. And we have all kinds of anomalies in the world where we've got voluntary carbon prices of, $5, lucky if we get up to $8, and then we've got carbon prices in trading systems and other compliance mechanisms of $100 or more. So this sends very perverse signals down those value chains. And it is in the emerging markets and developing economies where there is this sort of reasonable fear of a trading system that starts to lock them out through green industrial policy. This could go even faster. And what was important for me at COP was to see the Director General of the WTO sitting on the panel with the IMF and the World Bank, and this troika hopefully coming together back around to carbon pricing, which was a political imperative from the G7 and the G20 in the run-up to Paris, and then got dropped like a hot potato afterwards because it's difficult politically. But economically now, there's nowhere else to go. What we also see is that for emerging markets, developing economies in particular, they desperately need access to independent, high-quality advice on how to manage compliance markets, how to manage, eventually, Article 6 markets, if they ever come to be, or Article 6 activities, I'll come back to that, and then voluntary carbon markets. And the voluntary carbon markets are small. They could be very big. And there are some political constraints on that, and there are some technical constraints. Technical constraints, I think, are under management because people like Mark Carney have a whip, and they don't let the dust settle. But the private sector message, and this is where the CII I think is really important, and others, to government, that the carbon markets will only have the desired effect of a flow of finance into the parts of the economy that desperately need it in order to make the investments earlier than would happen otherwise, or to help countries invest in their adaptation and resilience. That this will only happen if we have integrity and if we have transparency in the market. And whereas it is attractive for those economies that need to offset some of their emissions at this part in their transition, to engage in bilateral deals that aren't transparent and that don't have any integrity built into them. It's attractive now, but it won't actually be a solution in the medium to the long term. We're going to have lots of people with buyer's regret, including the planet, in a very short period of time. And so we shouldn't learn that sometimes we need to be fast in this transition, but we all know that sometimes haste can slow us down. So it was a collective failure of government to not agree the rules around Articles 6.2, 6.4 and 8 at COP28. So I think COP28 gets very high marks for pledges. It gets reasonably low marks, B-, C, for binding commitments. And we will need them, because I think there is a limit to how much the carbon markets and other innovative finance benefits everybody unless the policy environment is global. And then the final thing I would say is that, you know, I spend a part of my life in academia, and we've spent an awful lot of time talking about and analysing policy and training people to understand policy. And where we've collectively failed, and this is something I think where the growth in the Indian academic and tertiary education sector can play an important role, is in how you manage policy reform when you're actually in power. So, you know, in elected democracies, India being the biggest, you're only in power for a certain amount of years. You've got to get in, you've got to get your team in place, you've got to get your policy agreed, you've got to get Parliament lined up, whatever. And then you've got to, you know, you've got literally months to get anything done and manage it before you're then thinking about the next electoral cycle. And I think that we have a huge bandwidth issue, and that includes in the international financial institutions a bandwidth issue of what you do, right? So we spent last year celebrating Ajay Banga's arrival at the World Bank. And now everybody's paranoid that, you know, if there's a Trump election in November, suddenly Ajay is going to be, you know, sitting in Washington with not so much to do. I mean, it applies in these institutions. Well, I'm not making a prediction about November, and I'm absolutely sure that my friend Ajay Banga will be able to perform miracles, whoever is in the White House. But we have a very short period of time which to get things done. So knowing how to get things done and supporting governments to get things done so that the private sector continues to move at the pace that it does is, I think, uppermost in my mind.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks also for not pretending to be an astrologer in terms of the likely outcome. But let me assure you that last night at the usual dinner, there was enough voices from the multilateral world, all of whom seemed to believe that Ajay's wicket, with both the current Biden administration, which has appointed him, and in the possibility of a change, will continue to be very robust and very strong. So I think that is would be a very strong anchor, Rachel, in terms of the uncertainties which lie ahead. Can I turn to you, Andre, that considering the initiative of President Macron in having specially convened at the last Paris forum, which just before the COP28, a special initiative by President Macron, where some of us were present, and on the issues of multilateral, and subsequently, thereafter, the decision that the monitoring of the decisions of that Paris forum would be undertaken by the OECD under Matthias Cormann. How do you see OECD's role in orderly management of continued macroeconomic stability, which is one of the important fulcrum of the OECD's charter, in being able to traverse these uncertainties, also address the issues of the urgency with which we need to harness finances and resources. And if you have any thoughts on the issues of transparency and credibility on the pricing of carbon market by having institutions which are robust. And I think that certainly, Rachel, you made a very, very important point that we need integrity and transparency in the carbon market. And what kind of a role do you believe OECD can play?
Thanks so much, Singh, and thanks for squeezing a little space at the table on the left wing from the audience. That's where the OECD feels comfortable. And Matthias Cormann sends his, we say goodbye to Mark.
Thanks very much.
So it's, I mean, Matthias Cormann sends his warm regards. He sent his Sherpa and his warm regards, and glad that I have the opportunity to make a few remarks. I mean, the question you posed to me is probably a $100 billion question to a certain extent in the current context, because I mean, this is a panel about the uncertainties of global growth. We have just revised our growth projections downwards. Global growth remains fragile from 2.9 in 2023, 2.7 this year. We have seen global trade has been surprisingly weak over the past year. Merchandise trade fell by 1.5%. And Vera mentioned, the geopolitical uncertainties, which will put high pressure on the global value chains. And at the same time, we observe, and you asked me about what is the OECD role also in helping to manage macroeconomic uncertainties. At the same time, we see mounting fiscal pressures on many countries. Some ease on the inflation front, but some uncertainty at the same time on the inflation front. And this comes together with the twin challenge to finance the green and the SDG transition. And you mentioned, you quoted the $4 trillion to finance gap for the SDGs. But at the same time, this is less than 1% of the trillions flowing through the global financial system. And both Mark, or both Rachel, Mark, Vera, you're working hard in kind of trying to get more private finance into the system. And this is something which we have been discussing as OECD and I'm very grateful for India's G20. We have been developing global blended finance principles to leverage public money with private money to bring together private money. We are tracking the $100 billion commitment from the advanced economies to developing countries. Our 2021 data, and this is the last available data, shows that we are not even there. We are at $89.6 billion currently. Very much hope that this $100 billion commitment will be met in 2023 and 2022, 2023 data. But we also see that only 16% of this money is linked to private finance. So there is room to maneuver. And I know that Mark is working really hard, and there are many things to do. But I believe there are three avenues which we need to pursue further. This is in the financing the green transition, align the financial sector with the Paris Agreement, finance national transition plan, and this is something we are currently discussing with the Brazilian G20 presidency. And President Lula has put a horizontal task force on global mobilization against climate change on the agenda, and one of the two items is climate finance. And this is something I believe we have an opportunity in partnership between public and private to see where we can really leverage what this is often quoted millions to the trillions. And this is something we've been working on. Then the second avenue, and you mentioned that we need to have a more honest, and Mark also mentioned that the question about the price on carbon is something where we need to have a more honest conversation. And Matthias Cormann therefore has launched at the OECD a new global initiative called the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, where we try to have to also look into ways of direct and indirect pricing of carbon, and to see what strategies countries really are having in an economic efficient way to reach their climate goals. So this is the second avenue. The third avenue I want to present here is the work we are doing on ensuring a fair international tax system that works for all, for advanced, for developing, for emerging economies. As you know, we have been advancing this base erosion and profit shifting action plan with now 150 countries members in the BEPS inclusive framework to make sure that big companies pay somewhere their taxes and thus to contribute to domestic resource mobilization in countries to attack also climate and green transition objectives. We now have the 15% minimum tax for digital companies, which is already implemented by a number of countries, and we hopefully get a solution or a deal by this year on the redistribution of taxing rights. But this is all meant, it's not for the sake of having a successful exercise at the OECD. It's really for the sake of mobilizing resources to set government in this uncertain growth and fiscal situation, to set them in motion for having an investment in those areas needed also to finance the SDGs and the green. And I guess I stop here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes to go, but I will really take a set of very rapid questions addressed to these panelists before I request really the president of the CII for his closing comments. To you, Rachel, I think that I want to pursue that we both agree that at the end of the day, you can take a horse to water, you cannot force it to drink. And the issues of uncertainty on the political matrix of it, the processes and procedures which you mentioned, the honeymoon period of any new government which you mentioned is true, particularly when governments are vulnerable to frequent renewal of their mandate by an orderly electoral cycle. How do we navigate and firm up and anchor something in this midst of all these uncertainties which we have? If you remember, Rachel, and Vera, you were there, that Larry asked this question, my very, very distinguished co-convener, that the issue of political will, how do we transcend these uncertainties? And if I were to suggest to you and ask you one-liner, what kind of an institutional anchor can help transit these inherent uncertainties? Rachel.
Well, I don't have a one-sentence answer. I think there are innovations in democratic process which are beginning to happen in some countries where if parliaments don't reflect the long-term needs of transition, both in terms of fixing inequality and climate, then you're starting to see people's assemblies which bring about constitutional change. I think Ireland and others have done this, and this is something that other big democracies are looking at. But the academic work that I'm doing is focused on governments in trade becoming more and more complicated, because we're just starting to have a conversation about tax, right? And it's focused on tax equity in tax systems, but there are more profound questions around what's happening to population and who can pay tax and what should we pay tax on, income or pollution or whatever. By the time we get to 2030, very few countries are going to have a tax system which is fit for purpose. I mean, it isn't now. It certainly won't be by 2030. By 2030, most countries who at the moment manage climate migration, if at all, in one ministry, manage immigration policy in another ministry, with totally different approaches. This will become one big problem. And so, not to answer your question, NK, but to say that the in-tray is going to get more complicated, and for business, how business engages with government over the kind of certainty that business needs, which has always been an issue, is going to become a bigger and bigger issue.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for reiterating the issue of uncertainty. Veera, do you want to say something in one or two sentences to the discussion which you have just witnessed? Veera.
Thank you again. I think three things that we need to take away with us. One is, and we're all agreeing, and we say that in the report, the institutions as they exist today to deal with the problems of uncertainty need some redressing. That we all agree. Probably in violent agreement, The question now is how do we do the implementation to adjust? And that's where it begins to become painful, right? We all agree with the sort of big, yes, that's change. But the minute we say this is what we need to do, it gets a little bit more difficult. But we also know what we need to do and we need to get on with that. I think that's the first one. And this really is about our shareholders and how our shareholders come about. The IMF reform is in train now. And we must go beyond the cosmetics of we're going to add one seat or we're going to do this. We need things like quota reform. We need things like local currency, FX borrowing, so that countries are not stuck with. This year, 2024, is going to be the year when emerging market economies are facing the steepest debt service obligations ever. Right, and in a world where we're going to have interest rates higher for longer, we must begin to think of how do countries grow, because we need growth, but using local currency. And I think that the international financial institutions and the people that we have around can figure out how to do this so that the emerging market economies and the frontier economies don't get stranded with the bag in their hands. That's number one. Very quickly and finally, the cost of finance. The cost of finance is a painful, painful problem. We're going to blend. We're going to find some ways of doing credit enhancements. But we must figure out what is a financial system whereby no emerging market economy is good enough to be AAA rated. There is a problem in that system, and I think that is what we need the MDBs to work with us with, so that we can actually make that a little bit of a bolder step. Yes, we are fighting and we're asking Ajay and the rest, not to sort of hang on to their AAA rating so that they can give more capital, but maybe we should be talking about the financial system unshackling a little bit of the regulation so we can do more. I think this is some of the things we need to take forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Since we have a hard stop in about 5 minutes from now, Andrea, thank you very much for assuring us that based on the discussions which the OECD is having with the Brazilian and others, you have a robust mechanism to pursue the new responsibilities of implementation which Matthias Cormann has taken on for the OECD, and thanks for that assurance. Finally, turn to you, Dinesh. First of all, let me say I must compliment you that it is under your presidency of the CII that two very important steps have been taken. First, a hook and creating a robust B20, which is the first initiative, an innovative initiative, and pursuing some of those recommendations, including the fact of setting up a global institute, which was hinted by the Chairman Tata Sons, who had chaired the B20. And second, getting CII as the voice of business and industry directly into the reform process of the multilateral development banks and shaping up the international financial architecture and the increasing international presence and participation of CII. I think it is under your leadership, Dinesh, this has happened, and so I wish to congratulate you on both these achievements. I now request you for some of your closing observations on the discussions to which you have just heard, and any other thoughts which you have. Dinesh.
Thank you. Thank you for your very kind words. And I think it is the entire CII team which made that happen in terms of following through on this. And as you said, the chair of Chandra. But it was a very fascinating discussion, to say the least, in trying to understand what the challenges of the macro is going to be. But as well as I think, Kavira, you mentioned in terms of the fact that the private sector today is actually stood as a strong, resilient manner in which the crisis was faced and which they have come out, I think is in itself an example of how we may have to look at the future. And what do I mean by that? I think it's the macro has to be converted to the micro. And especially on the climate transition, my view is there has to be a very strong commercial logic built into how we are going to go about doing this. My view is if we start with the trillions of dollars which we're going to require to make the change happen and hope to get it only from, I would call it the development banks and or other financing mechanisms, it's going to be very difficult for us. So the best solutions which I think we should be looking for is to build a commercial logic of providing micro solutions. Example, I would say, is the mobility solution in India or the renewable power solution in India, and see how we can leverage that to make the big change happen and get the private financing tied up for it. I think, Mr. Singh, I think you remember we were having this discussion as to how we are going to create commercial viability for many of these ventures. And that could be with support of the MDBs and or creating commercial viability of the projects in themselves. So if I looked at today's fascinating discussion, I think the takeaway for me would be that we cannot rest till we make the change happen. And the change has to come from both sides. One from the top, where we are working very strongly with the governments as industry, and with the MDBs as industry again, to force as much of the change as we can. And the second is, from the industry side, build commercially viable opportunities which can actually make a change with the way in which financing is done. The last comment is again a B20, I would call it feedback or outcome, which was to see whether we could create a strong pool of capital for this typical example of the CSR initiative, which worked of 2% of the profits going away. I think, Andreas, you mentioned saying that taxes should be paid. We are actually saying it is not a tax, it's a commitment to the future of society in making sure that that money comes in, which forms a pool of capital for the future. So thank you, Mr. Singh. I think really it's been your leadership which has made this happen. All the panelists for being here with us and supporting this thought process. This journey is not going to end with today. We will continue to engage and make sure we see success at the end of it. Thank you.